Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Himes, and I'd like to welcome you to the Cohu HD CoStar OptiCore webinar. I know your days are busy this time of the year, so I thank you very much for joining us. I think you'll find the time worthwhile, and I want to welcome everybody for attending this webinar. So, a couple of things. We're going to keep, we expect a very large audience today. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep you all muted. But if you have questions during the webinar, please send the question over the question icon within your webinar box. So you should be able to find that on the control panel. You can send your questions, and then at the very end, we will deliver the questions and answer them as they were received. So thanks very much, and I look forward to presenting Max Smith, our Field Applications Engineer. He will be conducting the webinar today. So Max, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. And as Jen mentioned, we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. We're excited to release OptiCore as we feel it's going to be a great benefit to all of our Rise camera users. So as we get started again, my name is Max. I'm a Field Applications Engineer with Cohu. As I look through the attendees, it's been great working with a lot of the folks that have joined us today. So we look forward to your feedback with OptiCore. And as Jen mentioned, please feel free to type any questions in and we'll respond to those as quickly as possible. So what is OptiCore? OptiCore is designed to basically simplify camera management. Things like mass updating camera firmware, managing camera users and passwords, being able to group and organize and even place your cameras on a map for easily tracking them down, as well as generating detailed reports. You can export entire camera lists for things like inventory management. Today, we'll go through a number of things, some tips on the installation, some of the initial settings with OptiCore. We'll add cameras a few different ways. We'll show you how to manage users, go deep into the tagging and filtering abilities, of course, managing and updating firmware, and also review in detail what that map interface can do for you. So OptiCore, number one, where do we get it? OptiCore is available right on our webpage, and there's a few different spots you can grab it. Number one, right on the homepage of cohuhd.com, there's a link for OptiCore. If you click that, you'll be able to download it. It's also available right in our support and then software download section. So within that link, you'll actually see two different installers. There's an MSI installer and an EXE installer. And if you run into issues where your network or computer policies don't allow you to download that EXE, the MSI is a great way to work around it. And again, either installer will give you the same software, just one will work better through antivirus and other network limitations. So once it's downloaded, OptiCore is going to store all the camera details in a database file. And by default, that database file is saved right on the PC that you're running on. You can also, depending on your layout, elect to save that database on a network share. Maybe multiple users want to point to that database. And one of the key steps to make that process happen is choosing the advanced section during installation. By clicking that advanced link, you'll be able to then change where the database file is saved just by simply clicking that change button. But again, you won't be prompted with that screen if you simply click the install and go through the basics. You will need to click the advanced link during the installer if you choose to do that. Now, it's worth noting that OptiCore wasn't really designed to have multiple users logged into the database at the same time. However, we realize that there may be shift changes at, say, like a traffic management center, where the daytime shift may need to log in, and then another user may need to log in from a different PC. And by saving that database on a different location, we can accommodate that, where different people from different computers can log in and access the same database. and that'll be more apparent as we go through the rest of the slides today. When you first launch OptiCore, the default username and password is admin. So let's go ahead and do that. And after login, you're prompted to immediately either change that password, or you can elect to keep the standard password of admin. But again, you'll be prompted as soon as you log in the first time. We'll go ahead and get logged in. Okay, so here's that first screen. Again, I can, if I wanted to set my password to something different, I can do that and then simply set password. And what this screen is doing is setting the password simply for access to OptiCore. At this point, we're not modifying any camera settings. This is all just for the OptiCore installation. So I'll choose to keep the current password. Now you'll notice right away that there's a little bell icon, and you're prompted to download the latest available updates. So anytime that we release a Rise camera firmware update or any update to OptiCore, OptiCore will automatically detect that and prompt you to download those files. So what we see right away, that top message is OptiCore is actually out there discovering Rise cameras. So by default, it's going to send a Rise discovery message right to your local network that the PC is attached to. The technical users in the group will probably realize that that message won't go to other subnets, and we'll go into that and how to add cameras that aren't on your local network. During discovery, we're also going to scan for changes. So in this case, my first discovery found 2 cameras, but every 12 minutes from now, OptiCore, when it's open, is going to reach out and look for any changes that may have occurred to those cameras, as well as any new cameras that may have come online. In the event that you cancel the discovery process as it's occurring, just keep in mind that the data that's displayed in your camera listing and the grid won't be up to date. So, all right, so let's talk about, again, that bell icon. All I need to do to grab the latest firmware is simply click the bell and then click yes. OptiCore is going to reach out directly to Cohu servers, download the latest available firmware packages for Rise cameras, and automatically register them. Now, if we take a step back and we think about the firmware upgrade process prior to OptiCore, it was pretty involved. You had to go to our web page. You had to download a file after logging in. You then had to save that file on your computer somewhere. You then had to log into the camera's web interface, upgrade the camera firmware files, which required 2 complete reboots, and then repeat that process for all available cameras. So one of the key benefits to OptiCore is being able to simplify that process and simply, with a click of a button, upgrade to the latest firmware without ever needing to open the web interface on your cameras. Okay, so that that download is done. You can see that the latest files have been downloaded. That bell icon won't be present unless there's an update available. So as we mentioned, cameras on that same subnet, in this case my local subnet, 192.168.10. have been automatically discovered. However, we realize that most everyone's installation won't have the cameras in the same subnet as the desktop PC. So we can add cameras, and we can add cameras a few different ways. Number one would be individually. So using that single camera IP, I can simply type the known IP address in. If you're using a cell modem or you do any port forwarding, you can adjust the web interface port. And then you'd simply enter the camera's admin password. Click Save. OptiCore is going to then reach out to that IP. If it is indeed a Rise camera and the password is correct, it'll pull that camera into OptiCore and add it to your camera list. Now, what's helpful is that oftentimes you'll have a whole network range that you wanted to add. So in that case, you could simply add by an entire subnet, and maybe you wanted to add from 1 to 254. And by clicking Begin Discovery, OptiCore is going to search every single address within that network range. Now, it's worth noting that we have limited this to the last octet, simply that last subnet. So you can search for up to 255 cameras at once. Please understand that you cannot search a wider range. Say you wanted to go 0.1 to 10, will prevent you from doing that. So it's only the last range. But again, that's a great way to add an entire range of cameras, and you can simply redo that for each of the subnets that you have. Now, one thing that's worth noting, when I'm adding cameras from a walking discovery, you notice that there's no password field and there's no port field. That's because OptiCore is assuming that you're going to leverage the standard settings. We'll go into that in just a minute. So managing packages is accomplished through OptiCore under the firmware link. And by managing packages, you can keep an entire range of different firmware versions in your system. We realized that although the most up-to-date firmware is what we recommend, some of our users tend to run firmware that may be a version old or older, depending on their network needs. And we designed OptiCore to work around that. So in this case, if you remember clicking the bell icon, we automatically downloaded the latest packages, and they've actually been registered already. But if we have older versions that we need to run, I can add those manually. I'll simply add the two, both the core and Rise firmware packages that I'd previously downloaded. OptiCore is going to scan those packages. It's going to try to identify what version is in those packages. And if it's an older version, you may need to tell OptiCore exactly what numerical version is. That way we can track it and manage it appropriately. So we'll wait for those to be copied in. One thing that's worth noting, OptiCore really isn't designed to work in any firmware older than version 3. So once I identify this package, it'll be available from our drop-down list. Okay, so how do we set what firmware we prefer to run? Again, by default, by opening OptiCore, clicking the bell, and downloading the latest, there's really no steps needed. But if you have multiple firmware packages registered, you can head over to Application Settings and choose a default core package and Rise package. So if I prefer to run an older version, I simply specify it here and then save. In this case, I do want to run the most recent one, so I'm going to set my preferred packages back to the most recent version. Other things we notice on the camera settings page, you can, if you choose, to disable the automatic refresh. There's some implications in doing this in that you can't accurately compare settings if we're not scanning for changes. The second thing you could change is how often we're looking for those settings. So in this case, every 12 minutes. By default, OptiCore is going to send discovery messages over all of your available network interfaces. And in my case, I know I don't have any cameras under my Bluetooth connection or under Wi-Fi. Everything's under my Ethernet interface. So you can disable those and it simply won't send discovery messages over those interfaces. This is a big one. If your agency has decided on a different default camera password and all of the cameras that you have deployed are already using that password, you can enter it here. That way, when you're doing a walking discovery or adding new cameras, it'll automatically pull cameras in using that default password. So we talked about the preferred packages. One kind of neat one here is the default web browser. I personally don't like Internet Explorer for my day-to-day browsing. I use Chrome or Firefox. So I don't want to change my computer's default browser. However, I know that with Rise cameras, to take advantage of our ActiveX control, I need to use Internet Explorer. So you can choose here only the default browser for the cameras. It's not going to make any changes to your Windows setting. If you're a user that uses, again, port forwarding, you can define different standard port that the camera is going to try to reach our web application on. You can also define your standard NTP server. Save those changes. All right, so camera details. When I click on a camera, there's a couple different ways to get to our camera details screen. Number one is by clicking the cameras menu and then camera details. Number two, I can simply right click on a camera, camera details. And the point of camera details here is to add a friendly name. So in this case, I know that happens to be my 4220 HD demo. And in this case, if you're, say, one of our DOT users, you could enter the mile marker or CCTV camera location. If you had any descriptive notes, you can add that. And what's really neat here is if you happen to have the GPS coordinates already known, you can enter those GPS coordinates right on this page. We'll see where that comes into effect with the map in just a moment. We also give you the ability to associate contact info with a specific camera. This is helpful from, say, again, a DOT level. If you have different agencies or different contractors that are responsible for maintaining different parts of your system. By adding that contact information here, everyone that uses OptiCore knows exactly who to call if there's any questions on that camera from a maintenance standpoint. Lastly, we can add tags. And tags are where we get into filtering and defining lists of cameras to both batch process changes in firmware or sort cameras. So I'll add a new tag. We'll call this demo camera. And I'll add one more. We'll call this upgrade group A. And one more, we'll call it dome cameras. So I know that this camera is a part of all three groups. So let's go ahead and we'll add a couple more details here. So this is a rooftop demo. And I know it's a demo camera and it's a dome, but I want it to be a part of upgrade group C. So by going in and defining these details, it's going to make our lives easier when we view cameras on a map level, as well as when we go in and start to do firmware processing. This one is a demo 4260 HD, and it's a demo, and this one is a positioner camera. And I want it to be a part of group B. So with those tags in place, I can now filter my camera list. So I can choose, let's see, I only want to look at my upgrade group A, and I only want to look at domes. And we can filter that list out using these tags. So this becomes great. Now let's say I only want to upgrade a portion of my cameras at once. I don't want to take all of my cameras offline at basically the same time. So by defining groups, you can then automatically filter out all the cameras that you want to update at one time and then do another group in the future. So it's helpful, and we encourage you to use that tagging feature. Again, that's all done through the camera details page under cameras, camera details, or by right-clicking cameras, camera details. All of our slides and a recorded copy of this webinar will be available online. We will follow up with the link. If you choose, there's also on your control panel off to the right a down or handout section that you can download data sheets, user manuals, and everything related to OptiCore. All right, let's talk camera users. So by default, our cameras ship with a number of users. And I can see that user group that's currently installed in the camera by clicking it, clicking list camera users. But I know that some of our clients prefer to not have an operator, a user, or anonymous. So you can actually create a new user group that works for your organization. So if I created a group that's called standard users, and I'm going to have an administrator, I'm also going to give my maintenance crew a login. And maybe that maintenance crew is an administrator. Maybe you choose to have them be a camera operator. This will impact what they can change within the cameras themselves. We'll keep them as an administrator for now. So now that I've defined a standard user group that has those two users, I can load that user group on one camera or many cameras by simply selecting them, again, one or multiple cameras, clicking load user groups, and then load users. So what we've done now, if I go back and I list the users of that camera, I've removed all the unused usernames, created one called maintenance, and I can do that again for one or all cameras without ever logging into the web interface. All right, here's the reason we're all here: multiple camera updates. So OptiCore makes this process very, very easy. We're going to automatically, once selected, update up to 5 cameras simultaneously. And if you end up creating a queue or a list of updates longer than 5, we'll simply work through them in a round robin. When one completes, we'll add the next one. So to upgrade cameras, all I need to do is find a camera that's out of date. Now you're noticing that this camera is red, where these, the versions, are black. And that all goes back to our preferred camera version. And that's under Firmware, Manage Packages. This is if we had different versions entered into our system, and we, from application settings, set a preferred version, anything that's not that preferred version will be highlighted as red in the list. So to update that camera, simply select it, Firmware, Upgrade. It's going to verify that these are the versions that you're loading into the camera. Yes. And at that point, you'll start to see off to the side the current action window is being filled in. So the same steps that you typically see during the upgrade process from the web interface, you can now keep a track of those using simply OptiCore. All right, so that's going to continue to work in the background. As long as OptiCore is running on that PC, it'll continue to update either a single unit or any group of cameras that you select. And again, this is where using the filtering tool would be helpful. Let's say I only want to look at upgrade group B and ignore all those in upgrade group A. In that case, you can simply select all the cameras, click upgrade, and you're off and running. Now, one thing that's worth noting is you can also update individual firmware files. This is a unique use case, but if you needed to only update, say, the RISE package, when you go to firmware and you go to upgrade, there's a little down arrow that gives you a little bit more flexibility. If you wanted to choose just one package, you can choose from your registered firmware, whether it's core or RISE, and it will load only that portion of the upgrade. You can also upgrade and choose a file. It'll actually then browse to a specific file on your computer and upgrade that to the camera. This is unique if you have to use, say you're one of our beta testers and you're uploading a different patch of some type. That function can help you do that. So within the camera list, there's also a number of other things that we can send to the cameras. You see that under camera management. Here I can click on a camera and change the date and time settings. I can have it set to the NTP server or sync right to my PC, as well as setting the time zone. Now you notice that we don't give you a spot to enter the NTP server. You may recall under application settings, you can define what NTP server you choose to use. So you'd enter whatever one is on your network. You can also compare settings. We'll do that in just a moment. you can set the IP address of the camera. Of course, we have to caution you here, if you set an IP address away from the current camera subnet, you may need to head out to the field to reach that camera again. So please use that function with caution. You can perform a full factory default on the camera. By double-clicking a camera, you can pull the web interface or click Web App, and it will do the same thing. It's also worth noting we do give you the ability to open the web interface on multiple cameras, but we're going to prompt you, because what's going to happen when you click yes here is you're going to open multiple instances, one copy of your browser for each camera. All right, mapping. So cameras, as we saw, can be assigned GPS coordinates from the camera details page. So I click on my 4220, and I click camera details. I've already added the GPS location for that unit. If I look at the camera map now, and I click show all cameras, there's that one unit that has a GPS coordinate. But I know I also have a couple units here that I haven't located on a map. So I could go into camera details, and enter the GPS coordinates. But I can also, right from the camera map, right-click right where the camera is located, click Set Location, and then choose from my list of cameras. And it's going to automatically take the location that I clicked and associate it with that camera. So I'll add the last one. Now, if you're noticing the list, you'll see an IP address and then a description. That description, simply put, is the camera alias. So in the event that you don't have a camera alias, when you go to add a camera, you'll just see an IP address. So it may make more sense when you add your cameras to add that alias right away, so you're not just looking at IP addresses. As an example, I'll show you what that's like. We'll add one more camera. In this case, the camera has a different password. And now as I add that camera, and it doesn't have an alias, if I try to position that camera, you'll just see the IP address. This is where having that alias makes it a little bit easier to interact with your cameras. We encourage you to associate an alias with all units. Other neat things you can do from the camera map, if you simply hover over one of the icons, number one, you notice they're all green. If for some reason there was a communication interruption or we didn't discover that camera in the last cycle, we'll turn that camera red. By hovering over, you get the basic camera details, essentially the same information that's displayed in our camera list or the grid. If you right-click on a camera icon, if you left-click on a camera icon, you can then also get a lot of the same functionality that you'd see from the camera grid. Okay, so we mentioned during the installation that you may need to have multiple different PCs connecting to the same database. Another use case is having multiple users for one PC running OptiCore. So when we head over to application settings, there's a section called Manage Users. And application users refers to OptiCore users, not camera users. So if you wanted to have a unique login for each of the people that will be accessing your OptiCore installation, you can do that from this window. We've also set up a list of permissions that each of our users for the application have. So from our user manual in the user permission section, you can see that the administrator, of course, has access to do everything, and then each of the user and anonymous groups have more limited access. Other things you can do from here, you can access a PDF copy of the user manual that's saved locally right on your PC. And you can also export a CSV. So a CSV is a comma-separated value file. And what it's going to do is save a file right to your local PC where you specify that includes all of the cameras in your system, as well as their serial number, IP address, even their name if you'd associated one with it, all the way down to the contact information and latitude and longitude. So this is a great way to look at all of your resources, see what serial numbers are deployed, where they're deployed based on either GPS or camera name, as well as manage packages. So you can see which cameras need updating and which ones don't. There's a few functions that, as of today, are unavailable on OptiCore, and that's because we're in the process of preparing for version 5.0 firmware release. And with version 5.0, OptiCore will display the camera uptime right in the list, as well as unlock some configuration options, including backup and restore. A very common setup is to log into a camera and do some stream configuration. And oftentimes, the stream configuration that you do, say you want to change the bit rate, you're going to drop the resolution and adjust the frame rate. And maybe these settings are the same on all of your cameras. In today's version, you'd need to go to System, Service, and then back up that configuration. You can then take that configuration and load it into other cameras. So starting with version 5 software will give you the ability to back up the camera settings and even restore them on one or multiple cameras using the backup and restore functionality. And we're working on version 5 right now. We expect it to be released in the near future. Other functions you see that are grayed out right now have to do with security. And version 5 of RISE firmware will include HTTPS. It will also include SNMP version 3. And with HTTPS, we have to deal with certificates. So you'll be able to manage, generate, as well as upload all of the certificates for your cameras if you choose to take advantage of HTTPS SSL. Again, you can do that right through OptiCore versus logging into the web interface on every individual camera. That can be a real pain if you have hundreds or more units. So again, expect the version 5 release in the near future. OptiCore, if you download and install it, next time you open it, if there is a version 5 update available, we'll prompt you with that bell icon and will automatically make the version 5 your preferred package. So at that point, we've kind of covered all the basic functionality, but I look forward to seeing if there's any questions. So let's go through the list. One question here, when you load a new user group, does it delete existing user groups or overwrite the data? So when I load a new user group, let's do that. I think we modified this camera. Let's take a look at the current users. So when I load a new user group, it's going to replace all of the existing accounts. Let's go through that process one more time. I'm going to manage this group. Add a new one, actually. If I don't add an administrator in this step, the camera will retain the existing administrative login. However, if I do add an administrator here and I change the password, the current administrator will be replaced with the new administrator's password. So if I only use the administrator, and I go back, and again, just for reference, I'm going to list the camera users. Currently, it is maintenance and administrator. And I load the test group, which just has the administrator. It's going to remove any user that is not in this group. So now if I list the camera users, that maintenance login is gone. This could be helpful if you're doing a new deployment and the maintenance contractor may need access to the cameras, but you don't want to provide your administrative login. You can create a unique user and easily deploy that across all the affected cameras. And then when time is right, revoke that access. So it's a very helpful security tool. Let's see if there's any other questions. How many cameras can OptiCore manage? Neil, good question. At this point, OptiCore can manage hundreds of cameras. I don't know that there is a hard limit. Can I upgrade all of my cameras at once? Yes. All you need to do is select all of the cameras that you wish to update from your list. Click Cameras, Manage, Firmware, Update, and it's going to reach out to all selected cameras and update all of your cameras at once. Again, I would encourage you to use the filters and assign upgrade groups. This way, if you have, say, 100 cameras, your operators aren't blind during the period that all those 100 cameras are being updated. So we'd encourage you to stage those updates. Is there any character limitation on the aliases? I don't know that we've limited characters, but I do believe there's a limit to the length. I'll have to follow up with you on that. Does this work with Elko Cameras? No, this will actually only work with Cohu Rise cameras and above. So Helios cameras, and of course older analog cameras, none of those would be applicable here, only Cohu Rise cameras. Could the software pull JPEGs of the cameras? Is it possible to place them in a folder by alias name? That's a very good question, Joseph. We are looking in future versions to include the ability to hover over a camera or grab a JPEG or request a JPEG from the camera in some way. So we'd certainly encourage you to provide any other feedback you have on that function and how you intend to use it. If you could shoot us an email at support@cohu.com with a few more details, we'd love to take a look at it. The next question from Christopher, on a network with no internet access, would updating the OptiCore software just be a reinstall over current version? Would settings be retained? So in the event that OptiCore itself cannot reach the internet, the bell function that we talked about earlier would not apply because, again, OptiCore is reaching out and fetching that data from the internet. So if you don't have internet access, you'd need to go to Manage Packages and add the packages that you downloaded earlier manually. Once that software is registered within OptiCore, OptiCore doesn't need to make contact with the internet. There's one limitation. The camera map, all the mapping you see here is actually Google Maps. So Google Maps, of course, is web-based, and you wouldn't have access to any of the mapping displayed if you don't have internet access on the PC running OptiCore. The next part of that question, would updating the OptiCore software just reinstall over current version? Would settings be retained? So all of our firmware updates will retain as many settings as possible. The only time that we don't retain a setting is if we've made a change to that specific setting. For instance, we recently increased our font sizes as a part of the firmware update. So in that case, the on-screen display and titles that you've already established were retained, but now they're at a larger font size. So to answer your question directly, would settings be retained? Yes, as much as possible. The last part of that question is, would it just reinstall over a current version? And yes, if I were to take a camera that's already running our latest firmware and click Firmware Update, it would simply reinstall the current version over the existing version. The last question is, would you ever add Helios camera to the program? We have several of them. At this stage, we have no plans of further supporting Helios from a OptiCore type layout. We'll continue to support any necessary bug fixes with the camera firmware itself, but we're not planning on incorporating Helios models into OptiCore. One thing that we didn't come up is the price of OptiCore, and OptiCore is free. It is free to add as many cameras as you have, and it's free to use, so there's no licensing requirements whatsoever. Okay, a question on camera firmware. Will this or other future updates allow the Rise camera to support motion recording? Any improvements that we incorporate into Rise camera firmware can be pushed out via OptiCore moving forward. I can't comment specifically as to what will or will not be on the roadmap as of today, but please know that any camera firmware updates can be pushed out via OptiCore. One last question on adding the 3432. The 3432 is our fixed barrel camera. At this point, there's no plan to bring that into OptiCore, but the future may develop. We'll wait just a few more moments for any other questions. Again, we really appreciate everyone's time. And if you have any further follow-up questions, please reach out to us directly. And many of you have my direct contact information, but for those that don't, please send us an email at support@cohu.com or right through our main support line using option 2.
Thank you, Max. Terrific job. We want to thank everyone for attending today. As Max said earlier, we will have the recording available as well as the presentation. We will be sending out a link with that information to all of you who attended. We will have future OptiCore webinars, so if you know any people that didn't make today's webinar, please make sure they sign up for the next one. Thanks, everyone, and have a great holiday.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
How many people did